All right. I think we're good to go.
The dulcet tones of Matthew Brinton. Check, 1, 2, check. There we go.
Perfect.
Welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, welcome, everyone, to this wonderful event, part of our series at Metropolitan State and MSU Denver's election series, this entitled Decision 2012, Latino Voters, Immigration Policy in the 2012 election. We're very happy to have everyone here, students, of course, and the members of the press and the our area community more broadly. We have an exciting program for you. We are going to be releasing some brand new polling data of Latino voters from a poll that's sponsored by America's Voice and conducted by Latino Decisions, one of the preeminent Latino public opinion firms out there. So it's a very special event for us to be able to host that here at MSU Denver. Before we get started, just let me introduce myself. My name is Rob Preuhs. I'm a political scientist here at MSU Denver. And I am fortunate enough to be kind of introducing you and welcoming you, as well as presenting this data, which will be the first segment of our event. Followed by this new data presentation, we will also be having a wonderful and have great fortune to have a wonderful panel, a panel discussion, including folks from the Latino community that will be discussing the results and some of their insights, the folks that we'll introduce as the panel gets started, but to include Olivia Mendoza from the Colorado Latino Forum, Grace Lopez Ramirez from Mi Familia La Vota, Sergio De La Rosa from Together Colorado Action Fund, and that panel will be moderated by, and we'll claim him, our very own affiliate faculty member, Professor James Mejia, who also, of course, is affiliated with Mejia and Associates and former president of the Denver Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Before we get started, and then just to give you a headline at the very end, then of course we will have about 20 minutes for dialogue and intellectual interaction as we open up for questions from the audience as well. Before we get started, I do have some acknowledgments and thanks. First, just in terms of quick announcements, if you're a member of the press and you haven't signed in, we have a sign-in sheet right over here that we would like you to sign in. Also, if you're looking for additional copies of handouts, Patty Kupfer from America's Voice will be taking email addresses, and we can send those handouts to you as well. This event, of course, would not be here if not for some generous sponsors and lots of help from both the MSU community and outside. From the MSU community, of course, our sponsors are Student Activities. And Matt Brinton has done such a great job helping coordinate this. Technologically inept professors also need lots of help, and Scott Houck and the folks from the tech side made this possible as well. We'd also like to thank the Political Science Student Association for sponsoring this event, and also America's Voice and Latino Decisions for allowing MSU to be the forum for releasing some of their brand new polling data. Let me begin then with my section of this presentation. We'll be looking at a newly released September-October poll of Latino voters in Colorado. The story of the poll is that there are some very clear consistencies in previous polls and some orientations towards of Latino voters in terms of party and candidate preference, but also some brand new data, including data looking at the asset bill, support for the asset bill, something that's very familiar to the MSU community, as well as some interesting new findings regarding levels of enthusiasm, which may question some of the previous understanding of lower levels of enthusiasm. We will have certainly a discussion about that in our panels, and we can do that within the audience as well. Let me begin by giving you a little background of the poll. This poll is sponsored, of course, by America's Voice, an immigration reform advocacy group, and conducted by Latino Decisions, one of the preeminent Latino polling firms in the country. It's a random sample of 400 Latino registered voters fielded between September 29th and October 4th of 2012. The survey was conducted by bilingual interviewers and thus conducted in both Spanish or English, depending on the preference of the respondent. We have a maximum margin of error for you folks that just came from my statistics class. It varies, particularly depending on the split. But the maximum margin of error we can expect to be about 4.9%, with some responses lower. I'm going to present some data in sections. First of all, in terms of public policy viewpoints and important issues, particularly focusing on immigration. One of our key focuses here is the role of immigration and preferences regarding immigration on the Latino vote, with dealing with this underlying narrative of how important immigration is to Latino voters and what kind of movement in terms of public policy that the current administration, as well as the opponents, the candidates, the Romney campaign have proposed, and what kind of influence those have on voter decisions, particularly Latino voters in such a key battleground state with a large Latino population that has been reasonably well important and influential, and some of our best scholars, political scientists, have estimated had a true impact on previous elections, both in our 2010 election as well as our 2008 presidential election. So on to the data. First of all, one important finding that this poll reveals is that immigration continues to be one of the top priorities for Latino voters. Taking a look and being asked what are the most important issues faced when you think of Congress and the President and these groups should address. The economy came out with a slight lead of 45% of respondents responding that the economy, jobs, something along those lines were important. Immigration, DREAM Act citations in terms of issues came in second, actually a fairly close, obviously close margin. Third and fourth were healthcare or education and healthcare respectively, relatively distant but also important key issues. Further issues, and there certainly was a list, started to look at 1% and 2%, so we are not included in this graph. Let me, before we move on too much further, specific questions and responses are in the top line information that was handed out to you. So if you want to take a look at what was included in the economy and what was included in the immigration policy, as well as the specifics for the questions, those are there. What I'm showing on the slides are sometimes more general in nature. So the economy tops the most important issues for the Latino community. That's not surprising. Immigration is essentially tied, though, and that may be surprising, particularly with some new data that suggests that Latinos look at immigration as an important issue, but perhaps not one of the most important issues. But not only does immigration seem important, it's also, when asked in a slightly different way, how important is the issue of immigration in your decision to vote and who to vote for in this election, essentially trying to measure the impact of immigration on voting decisions. We find a rather large proportion that suggests that it's either the most important issue, 24%, roughly a quarter of Latino samples, suggested it was the most important issue in their decision to vote, or one of the most important decisions to vote. And when you combine these two, we're looking at approximately 60% of Latino community, suggesting that it's either one or the most important issue in their voting decision. Which suggests, of course, that immigration is an important issue for candidates to address in their campaigns and in their public policy promises. In terms of preferences for immigration and immigration policy, they vary, and perhaps not terribly surprising, immigration policy that's proposed by the Obama administration, specifically questions asking about dealing with the new DHS directive compared to immigration policy that's been proposed by the Romney administration. We essentially measure this by asking two questions, one, both giving brief descriptions of each candidate's immigration policy, and then asking whether this made you more enthusiastic, less enthusiastic, or had no effect. As you can see About 54% of Latino respondents said that they were more enthusiastic about voting for Obama, given the description of the policy and the DHS directive, compared to only about 9% that said less enthusiastic. Almost 90% then are either more enthusiastic or unaffected by Obama policies. This is converse, right, or reverses when we take a look at the Romney campaign policy statements. Here, when read, respondents reacted negatively. 64% were less enthusiastic about the Romney campaign when given an objective description of immigration policy based on campaign statements. The net effect, we can do the addition, I have not, but essentially it's quite clear that the Democratic Obama candidacy and their policy positions have raised enthusiasm regarding immigration policy, whereas the Republican Romney campaign and their immigration policy has lessened enthusiasm or lessened support generally. Right? So immigration is a top issue, an important policy issue in terms of decision making, and clearly among the Latino communities tends to go towards the Democratic candidates, and by a fairly wide margin. Of particular importance to the MSU community and Colorado specifically, of course, this last state legislative session, we had a debate over the asset bill, which provided a kind of a reduced outstate, non-resident tuition for Colorado high school graduates who are undocumented immigrants. A few more provisions, of course, come along with that tuition level. It failed in the Colorado state legislature, but our own Board of Trustees has adopted essentially one of these types of policies for our own tuition rates. Note that overall, if we ask folks, do you support or oppose the asset bill to allow undocumented immigrants, youth to attend college here in Colorado and not have to pay the higher non-resident rates, 76% when we combine strongly support and somewhat support this type of legislation. 58% strongly support this type of legislation. It's very, almost essentially a consensus within the Latino community. Now, we can break this down a little bit because this is actually fairly universal support, not quite as strong across groups. But one of the key components that we can take a look at is partisan support. And it looks like, essentially from our polling data, that support for the asset bill is strong across partisan orientations. A relatively small percentage of the sample, by the way, are Republican identifiers, roughly 15%. But among those, as well as among independents and certainly among Democrats, support, when we combine strong and somewhat supportive of the asset bill, is fairly high. Democrats, 80%, support this bill, 76% of independents, and 59%, almost 60% of Republicans support the bill as well. So clear, relatively broad-based support for asset bill type legislation in Colorado among the Latino community. I want to move on now from immigration policy, which is an important element of our discussion here and certainly a part of the focus of our panel discussion and our reaction, to new data, essentially taking a look at general support among the candidates. We are, after all, a battleground state, and Latinos being an influential demographic within our state, knowing exactly where preferences lie matters. The key story here is that support for Obama, rather than waning over time, has essentially remained relatively stable, if anything, bumped up a little bit. We have the fortune of having data from a June 2012 battleground poll by Latino Decisions and America's Voice as well, and we can make these comparisons. The bottom bar, by the way, is the June results. The top bar is the new September-October results. And the data provide both essentially give us the Romney, which includes certain voters, likely voters, and leaning voters, as well as the Obama, certain, likely, and leaning. Those are combined in this data set or in this presentation. But it's clear that the data looks much like it did in June, with 74% of Latinos in Colorado supporting or intending to vote or leaning to vote Obama, compared to about 20% for Romney. Now, those numbers essentially have increased slightly for Obama, not a huge increase given a margin of error that we might be looking at, but they have not also increased for Romney. This is not a function of undecideds going both ways. It seems that it's solidification of Obama support in my interpretation. Not just presidential support, but we of course have some close congressional district races. We don't have data broken down by congressional district, just we start to dissect the sample a little bit too small. However, overall, when asked, about 64% of Latinos in Colorado say they would support the Democratic candidate, and for sure will lean or will vote for the Democratic candidate. Adding 8% or 4% for leaning, you're looking at about 68% support for the Democratic candidate in their congressional races in a generic congressional race preference question. About 12% are undecided. Just under 20% are leaning Republican or will vote Republican. This matches up fairly well, of course, with the presidential preferences. So it looks like in terms of Latino votes, we're not seeing fundamental differences across levels of office in terms of voting preferences. And finally, we'll take a look at some striking results regarding enthusiasm for the election. Part of the narrative, and I've given this narrative in interviews with some of you out there, but also in general, my sense was that this is a race between economics, which benefits the Romney campaign at the national level, but also in Colorado, and demographics, and particularly in terms of the demographics, in mobilizing groups that were previously mobilized in the 2008 election. One of the narratives and seeming from some of the data that we've seen before is that one of the problems for the Obama campaign and one of the benefits for the Romney campaign was a growing level of apathy or declining enthusiasm for their candidates in this current election relative to the previous election. Well, we can measure, at least in levels of enthusiasm, by asking folks how enthusiastic they are, and that's fortunate enough to have this kind of data to present to you as well. As it turns out, maybe this dominant narrative isn't as clear-cut as possible. These are graphs of folks from within the survey that reported either being very enthusiastic about voting in the 2012 election, and that's the first set of bars on your left. On the right is a question which asks, are you more enthusiastic in 2012 than in 2008? Were you more enthusiastic in 2008 versus 2012? Or is the level of enthusiasm about the same? What we find is actually some fairly striking and high levels of enthusiasm among Latino voters here. If demographics is about both preference, which we've just shown tends towards the Obama camp, but also about mobilization, getting out to the polls. You can't have your vote registered or counted if you don't vote. The influence is diminished greatly, of course. Then enthusiasm becomes an important issue. And here what we found, and again we can compare the June 2012 battleground data with the September-October 2000 data, and what we see is an increase over this time period in enthusiasm, both in terms of the percentage of the Latino community reporting being very enthusiastic about voting in this upcoming election, but also in terms of the percentage of folks reporting that they're more enthusiastic about this election than 2008. And that's perhaps the most surprising finding regarding the enthusiasm levels. We now are looking at a majority of Latinos, at least in terms of the polling results, that are more enthusiastic now than 2008. And keep in mind that the level of enthusiasm was probably unprecedented in 2008. So you have some diminishing marginal returns. That is, we don't expect really high levels to maintain themselves. So this is actually quite striking. And of course, well over 2/3 report being very enthusiastic about the race. Now, we don't know if that exactly translates into going out to the polls and voting, but that's the assumption here, and I think a reasonable assumption as well. Now, a couple of things that we may want to kind of question, and is this really enthusiasm that is sustainable across a number of different important segments of the electorate? It turns out kind of, right? Mostly. If we take a look at each bar represents folks that are either certain to vote for Obama, reported certain to vote for Romney, self-identified Democrats, Republicans, and independents as you go down the left side of the graph, reports the percentages of individuals that report being very, somewhat, not too, or not at all enthusiastic about this upcoming election. Note that the Obama versus Romney levels of enthusiasm among Latino voters is about the same with Obama supporters being very enthusiastic, about 73% of Obama supporters being very enthusiastic. When we add somewhat enthusiastic, you're pushing, of course, above the 90% measure. The combination of those two, again, for Romney is actually fairly high as well. So Republican Latinos are very enthusiastic about this race, and Romney supporters are. When we start to break this down between Democrats, Republicans, and independents, partisanship and strength of partisanship generally has a relationship between your going out to the polls. That is, strong partisans vote more often. They're more enthusiastic about the election. They see clear differences across candidates. And we're seeing that same kind of thing in this polling data as well. Democrats and Republicans at 73% and 78% respectively report being very enthusiastic. Again, adding the somewhat enthusiastic measures, and we're over 90% of both Republican Latinos and Democratic Latinos reporting being enthusiastic about this election. Among independents, the enthusiasm level, as we would expect, is actually a bit lower, with roughly half being more or very enthusiastic. But once we add somewhat enthusiastic, levels of enthusiasm are still relatively high, and perhaps surprisingly high, still approaching that 90% measure. So the story here, to some extent, is that enthusiasm among Latino voters is quite high, perhaps surprisingly high. We can also, of course, dissect this in terms of relative enthusiasm compared to 2008. The same type of story emerges, except there's a bit more difference between Obama supporters and Romney supporters. Among Obama supporters, more than half, 52, I shouldn't say only, 52% report actually being more enthusiastic this year than in 2008. Again, that's a striking finding. It's smaller than the Romney supporters' levels of enthusiasm, but it's actually quite high, given, again, the dominant narrative of a Latino community that's disappointed in both the lack of movement in immigration policy, as well as a stagnant economy that has affected the Latino community to much greater extents than the Anglo community here in Colorado. Between that and feeling about the same level of enthusiasm, and again, we have a fairly high bar in 2008 to meet, we're still looking at just over 80% of Obama supporters being very enthusiastic. This suggests that maybe that mobilization issue isn't quite as large, and we're certainly going to have a little discussion about that. It's a surprising finding to me. It's a surprising finding to several of our panelists as well. The same types of things in terms of Democrats, Republicans, and independents tend to emerge as well. Slightly less overall enthusiasm, but still a solid majority being more enthusiastic in this election than in 2008. Among Democrats, among Republicans, a good deal more enthusiasm. We would probably expect to see a greater amount of turnout, but again, Republicans constitute about 15% of our survey, 15% of Latinos in Colorado, and independents being at the lowest level of overall enthusiasm. Democrats, by the way, constitute about 52% of our sample, and our inference or estimate is about 52% of Latinos in Colorado. It was a quick survey, and those are the key points that I wanted to make for you. To sum up, we can take a look at these key findings from Colorado. First of all, and I think striking, is that immigration is one of the top issues. If anything, it equals, within margins of errors, the economy as one of the most important issues cited by Latinos that Congress and the President need to face. Second, It's also, by the way, a very strong issue in terms of voting decisions, with a vast majority reporting that immigration policy has an effect on their voting decision. Second, in terms of Colorado links, specific Colorado links, there's a strong level of support for the asset bill among the Latino community. And that level of support, while it varies across partisan identification and to some extent some other demographic groups, generally does not fall, and certainly does not fall across partisan identification, below 50% when asked whether folks strongly or somewhat support. So a large degree of support among the Latino community, regardless of partisan identification, for the asset bill. Support for Obama remains high. Right? If anything, a little bit higher than we measured in June of 2012, but for the most part, there's consistent support. It doesn't seem to be falling off by any means either. And then third, and this is probably the most striking, is that while the narrative has been that enthusiasm has been waning, our data suggests that enthusiasm for both the vote and enthusiasm then across partisan and candidate supporters remains very high, both relative to the 2008 election, but also in absolute terms when asked how enthusiastic people are. This may be an important story in terms of this election, as Colorado becomes one of those close states, and voter preference combined with voter mobilization are going to be key to either candidate's victory. That's the end of the data presentation. We had a bit more, and of course you can get the top lines from Patty Kupfler, and we can send those to you as well. If you have specific questions, I ask that we hold off until after our panel discusses some of these results, and we'd be happy to discuss them with you. And also, I would be happy to chat with you after our discussion and our event here, and if you have any requests or questions about specific breakdowns or demographic groups or relationships, be happy to kind of follow up with you on those kind of things. But that ends our data presentation portion of the discussion. And now we're really fortunate to have within our kind of intellectual community James Mejia to moderate an excellent panel. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping over one more.
No more data to go.
We have more data to go. My students from the data class are like, oh, good, we're finally done with the data. One more piece of data. We're fortunate actually to have Gabe Sanchez, Associate Professor of Political Science from the University of New Mexico, and he's the Director of Research for Latino Decisions. And he's going to provide some of a bit broader context from the battleground state polls to take a look and see where Colorado and where these data fall in a larger comparative perspective. So without Gabe?
Thanks, Rob. A little more data, but promise I think it's only like 3 slides worth of data in the context of what some of our national numbers are kind of showcasing. So it's a pleasure to be here in Denver. I actually have a ton of family here. I was able to fly in and spend the night with my grandmother, who's actually here representing the Sanchez clan of my family here in Colorado. So my grandma and my aunt are here, so I'd like to say hi to them. To be honest, I think they were more excited about seeing our esteemed moderator than me, but we could talk about that after the context. So what I want to do is give you at least some context of how Colorado, in terms of the numbers that we've seen, fits with what we've been tracking at Latino Decisions for the past several weeks in terms of the national Latino electorate numbers. One of the things that we're fortunate to have at Latino Decisions is literally so much data that we feel sometimes like we're swimming in data, because the data comes in so fast and we have so much context to be able to provide with the numbers. So one of our clients, Impromedia, which is kind of the Spanish language conglomerate folks, hired us to do a weekly tracker poll where we're surveying about 300 Latinos nationally every single week down the home stretch of the election. And the value of that data is we're able to really follow what's going on the ground in terms of the election and the campaign season. Everything in terms of the data that you see here, picking up the conventions, for example, you see early on between week 1 and week 2 where we started to see that dynamic play out. Both candidates received a bump among Latino voters, but the bump for President Obama was much higher than it was for Romney. I think Romney's at that point was about only a 4 percentage point bump after his convention. What was interesting for us at Latino Decisions is this was the first time where you really had very prominent Latino spokespeople on both sides, Republican and Democrat, speaking during the convention. So we were actually able to capture that. We asked questions in that context of the surveys. Did it matter to your vote? To see folks like our Governor Martinez, for example, out of New Mexico, speaking on the Republican side, Mayor Castro on the Democrat side. And actually there was bumps in both sides, but actually much smaller than we might expect in terms of having, brown faces showcased in those conventions. So this tracker poll is able to pick some of that dynamic up. What I really want to focus on is if we look at week 7, you kind of see how things have waxed and waned throughout the several weeks that we have here presented. But at week 7, we really see, at least in the context of President Obama's lead here, 72% overall to 20% for Romney. Romney's really bottomed out more recently. On Monday on our blog, we'll release this week's poll, which will have data specifically on the first debate, which I would expect Romney to have a little bit of a rebound given his performance, but I do expect it to be somewhere close to what the president did with Latino voters back in 2008, which is about 68% of the Latino vote. So that's somewhat what we're projecting. One thing I'll say in the context of this data, what Latino Decisions does is different than most survey firms that focus on projected turnout, projected vote choice. Most folks just ask you the question, who are you likely to vote for in the election? We dig a little bit deeper than that and use a lot of the information that's available in the survey. For example, how you voted in previous elections. How strong is your party preference? So we take all of that information and we think we have much more accurate prediction data than most of the firms out there that only really ask you the question and run with that. Same story here in the context of the generic House vote. We're seeing similar numbers, right, that what you've seen in the context of Colorado specifically. This data is extremely important because although all eyes obviously are on the presidential race, what happens in terms of big domestic policy, of the future of Affordable Care Act, what's going to happen with immigration policy, probably hinges at least as much with what happens in the House races across the nation as what happens with the presidential race. So what we see here, very similar to what you saw within the context of Colorado specifically, is at least among Latino voters, Democrats across these House races all over the country have a pretty strong advantage among Latino voters. And that's kind of consistent with what you've seen in the context of Colorado. Another reason why this is important in our surveys across these weeks, we're asking specifically, who do you blame in the context of a lack of comprehensive immigration reform being passed? Is it basically on the president or Republicans in Congress? And Latinos overwhelmingly are saying it's Republicans in Congress that bear the brunt of that blame. So this, I think, this picture captures some of that dynamic that's really going on in terms of what's in the minds of Latino voters when they approach the House races. What I think is the most important slide to kind of give you a real comparison of how Colorado plays out with some of the other battleground states. We've had events like this happen already across some of these other states. You see that Virginia and New Mexico are still to come, so we don't have the data there yet. But this gives you a real good idea of how the trends that we're seeing in this particular state compare with other battlegrounds as well as the national averages from our national surveys. So a couple things to point out. Overall, support for President Obama among Latino voters in Colorado was slightly higher, but around the range of the national data that we're seeing for Latino voters. In terms of the Democrat-Republican numbers, similar story there, basically right in line with the national averages. One important exception that you see here is the state of Florida, which is basically the only place where we're seeing not overwhelming support for Democrats and President Obama, but even in that context, right, the president is polling the majority of Latino voters even in the state of Florida. That's an important state, obviously, as you folks remember, from 2008, pretty unique in the context of President Obama being able to capture that state. Many people argue largely based on his support among Latino voters in Florida. What I really want to focus your attention on is the very enthused numbers that you see there in turquoise, second from the bottom, that basically point out, as kind of the sidebar indicates, that voters in battleground states are much more engaged than our overall national numbers. You see enthusiasm nationally among Latino voters is about 53%, which is what I think a lot of folks perceive as what's happening on the ground. You hear reported in the media this problem among Latino enthusiasm for President Obama and the Democrats, and that I think is very much the case nationally, not so much across the battleground states. And that makes a lot of sense, right? You don't need a PhD in political science to realize that in the battlegrounds, that's where all the attention is focused. right? You've seen huge explosions in media advertising dollars pumped into these battleground states. The state of Colorado, for example, has benefited largely from a perception that in New Mexico, Romney perceives it's not in play for him. He actually pulled out a couple of weeks ago a lot of his high-level staffers from New Mexico and moved them up north here to Colorado. So I think it makes a lot of sense that the enthusiasm levels are going to be higher for Latino voters in Colorado and other battlegrounds than what you're seeing nationally. Nationally, Latinos are just not being courted as much this time around as they were back in 2008, and I think the data bears that out. Finally, this data that I'll talk a little bit more about here in a moment, know somebody personally, right, who is undocumented. You see those numbers, which for a lot of people are pretty striking, right? In the context of Colorado, nearly 70% of Latino voters. So remember, these are voters, likely voters, right? All U.S. citizens, all registered to vote. 7 out of 10 of those individuals in Colorado know somebody personally who's undocumented. And I think that really speaks to some of the numbers that we see in regards to the salience of immigration policy. So to kind of close things out in the context of immigration, I think it's important to address this issue because just like in New Mexico, a lot of folks, I think, are a little bit surprised to see immigration policy polling so high among Latino voters. The foreign-born population, both in New Mexico and Colorado, is significantly lower than you see in California, Texas, and Arizona. So I think a lot of people say, well, why would Latino voters, particularly those that are third, fourth, fifth generation, in the context of my family, been in this territory since the 1500s, why would they care about immigration policy? Aren't they far removed from the immigrant experience? And I think this data really bears this out. This comes back from June of 2011, a national survey. It asked, very, very directly, do you happen to know somebody who is an undocumented immigrant? You see nationally, 53% of Latinos overall. Again, all registered voters, all U.S. citizens indicating that they do. And in this context, right, do you know anybody who has faced detention or deportation for immigrant reasons? This number, I think, when I put this out on our blog, generated, at least at that time, more attention than any other number that we'd ever released. Because I think folks were saying, wow, 25% of Latino voters know somebody personally who's actually faced, immigration challenges because of their status. And I think for me, this is what provides the context for the numbers that we see related to immigration. It's not just a policy discussion anymore. We're really seeing this becoming personal for Latino voters. I've been doing a lot of, academic research on this issue. I think if this was 2005, we'd be having a much different discussion. I don't think immigration would be polling nearly as high as it is now. But obviously, since 2006, particularly the climate surrounding immigration policy coming from the right has been at least perceived among Latino voters as being anti-Latino in nature. And I think as soon as that shift has happened, we've seen a major surge in terms of the salience of immigration policy, but also Latino voters overwhelmingly moving to the left on that issue. 10 years ago, it actually was much more like a 50-50 split among Latino voters on immigration policy, their attitudes towards that. That's changed significantly during this particular climate, and I think that's really the backdrop that I think is important to understand the context of those numbers that we see related to immigration. So as I promised, wouldn't be a lot more data. I think that closes out the formal data presentation, and we can get a little bit to the panel.
Well, thanks very much to Dr. Preuhs for starting us off and really laying out top-line data from this new poll. And we're getting used to seeing MSU Denver take the lead on issues with regard to the Latino community. So thank you, Dr. Preuhs, for your continued study and pushing on these issues. Dr. Sanchez, welcome to Denver. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for sharing some of the information on how this poll may relate to other polls around the country and some of the trends with regard to Latino voters. Let's get into the panel discussion. And I'd like to welcome Grace Lopez Ramirez she's the Colorado State Director for Mi Familia Vota. Thank you very much for being with us. Olivia Mendoza, she's the Executive Director from the Colorado Latino Forum. Both of them work directly with potential Latino voters in the state of Colorado and have a on-the-ground perspective. So going to be very interested to hear from them. And of course, Sergio de la Rosa. He's a dreamer, and he's a leader with Together Colorado Action Fund. So we'll open it up and listen to everyone's story here. Grace, if I could, I'd like to start with you. Over half of the Latinos who were surveyed in this report were reported as being more enthusiastic in 2012 than in 2008. And for those of you that work in the field directly with potential Latino voters, is this reflective of the enthusiasm that you're sensing and that you're seeing out in the field?
Thank you, Jaime. I think, first I'd like to say Mi Familia Vota is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working in 6 states this year. We've been in Colorado since 2006, so we've really seen how the mobilization of the Latino community and the Latino vote here in Colorado has moved in these 6 years. From 2006, when we had a very high enthusiasm for comprehensive immigration reform with marches, and then now in 2012, 6 years later, when we still have not seen comprehensive immigration reform. So getting to your question, Jaime, one more thing. Mi Familia Vota is nonpartisan, so we don't endorse candidates. So just want to make that clear. This was super surprising to me because we, here have been working, our primary objective mission as an organization is to register voters, register Latino voters, educate Latino voters, and get them out to vote, mobilize them. And so we've been working steadily for these last 6 years within the community, partnering with community organizations, registering voters, having those conversations about the importance of voting as a family, and have not seen the enthusiasm this year. Earlier in the year, we kicked off our large-scale voter registration campaign in the spring, and it took a lot of convincing at first to let people know, you really need to register to vote. Your vote is important this year. We certainly were not seeing on the ground the enthusiasm that we had seen in 2008. We have been working with media partners, with other organizations like Together Colorado and Colorado Latino Forum to bring more information to the community, to start drumming that beat towards the election. Why is this important? And I'm glad to see that some of those efforts have really paid off because enthusiasm has grown. And I think that means, finally it's getting into the community's brain that we are 3 weeks away from election, and it's important for all of us as a community to engage in these issues, to educate our communities about these issues, and to get out and vote. So for me, that was very interesting to see that we have been able to move that dial towards more enthusiasm than we had seen earlier in the year.
Several days ago. Is this study consistent with your findings? I'm interested in both the enthusiasm marks, but also we saw immigration reform in the DREAM Act amongst the top 2 of the most important issues. Is that consistent with what you found in your own survey?
Thank you, James. So also just to sort of introduce the organization, the Colorado Latino Forum is a membership-based organization, a 501c4 organization, and our sister affiliate, GLADO, conducted this survey, which is the 501c3 organization. And I would suggest that what I found to be very interesting is resoundingly, every time you reach out to Latino community members, especially when it comes from bilingual individuals who are able to interact in the Latino community in their native language, and also from community-based organizations like ours, what we find is that there are top 4 policy issues, consistently top 4, and those are education, jobs and economy, immigration, and health and human services, or health issues. And I think that what this information tells us is that immigration was one of the top priority areas that, really almost tied for first place. In our survey, it was a statewide survey, and we reached all corners of the state, and we found that education was the number 1 priority for Latinos. But when you really dig down into that data, what you find is that oftentimes when people are referring to education, they're talking about access to affordable higher education. They're talking about their students having quality education opportunities, the DREAM Act, things like asset. So for the Latino community, you don't separate out immigration policy from education policy. They're interwoven. Issues like predatory lending in the jobs and economy, or opportunities to start your own business for Latino small businesses, is very much woven into immigration policy, because you have to have protection for these immigrants, as well as opportunities for people to be able to start working in this country. So what I have found to be very interesting is that all of these issues are always in the top 4, and that they belong together, they're interwoven, and we should talk about them in that manner as policies that that have to go hand in hand to advance these communities.
And Olivia, what about the issue of enthusiasm? Are you sensing, are you seeing that same kind of enthusiasm?
You know,
out in the field?
I would kind of echo what Grace just noted. What was most surprising about our survey and interesting about this one is the level of frustration with the gridlock. One of the components that we asked at the very end was, if you could ask the presidential candidates any question, what would you ask? And I really was expecting all the questions to lean toward jobs and economy or education, as were the top sort of indicators. Resoundingly, it was, how do you work together in this political climate? So I think that that's tied very closely to enthusiasm. People either feel enthusiastic about getting out to vote if they feel like there's going to be progress made regardless of who the winner is, or they start to feel frustrated. And I think that it's very important that we as community members and people that work in public policy are able to talk to our Latino community members about gridlock is directly tied to our ability to access the ballot box. And people are, there's only gridlock if we don't push our electeds on both sides to care about these policy issues for our community.
Yeah. Thank you. And Sergio, you were a dreamer. And so to see that data up there that says 3/4 of Colorado's Latino community support the asset bill that provides the opportunity for undocumented students in their collegiate studies without having to pay an out-of-state tuition rate. Of course, we know on this campus, Metropolitan State University has created a special tuition rate for undocumented students. Scores have taken them up on that offer, on the opportunity to study. What's your message for Metro along those lines, and do you believe that Obama's stance in support of the DREAM Act will indeed persuade voters?
Well, the first thing that I want to say is a gigantic thank you to Metro State for this opportunity that they've given us. I'm personally going to be attending this school starting in the spring of next year.
That's great.
But what I believe is that all of the events that have just taken place, all of the DREAM Act and all this deferred action stuff, isn't coming out of the current administration's kindness. They're not doing this because they felt like doing it. They're doing this because the Dreamers put pressure on them. And now, I guess, was the most strategic time for them to be able to work on this. I mean, we've been, there's been people who've been doing hunger strikes at the OFA offices. You know, there's been entire rallies, there's been, walkouts. We've had all sorts of things that we've been trying to, push for our current administration to be able to respond in some way towards what we're trying to do. And I guess that this response, as the way that we perceive it at least, is that it's only buying us time so that we can further work on the DREAM Act. And I believe that just with that, a lot of the Latino voters are going to be a whole lot more enthusiastic about perhaps helping us with the progress of our work.
Did you feel this, the change in June when you saw the Obama administration come out with declarations that there would be a decrease in deportations for those that are attempting to study in this country, and ways for young people indeed to work? Did you sense a change in the campaign and amongst Latino voters with regard to that change in the Obama stance?
Absolutely. There was absolutely a change because, according to our numbers, we see that there's a large number of people, a large number of Latino voters who personally know someone who's undocumented, and all of this just seems kind of like a brand new start for a lot of us. After losing hope, after finding out that pivotal moment in our lives when you find out what it really means to be an undocumented student, to understand that you've worked extremely hard throughout your entire pre-collegiate life, just so that when you're standing outside of those doors in the university, you realize, oh, well, can't really pay for this. It kind of becomes a false hope. But with this change in the administration, it's like I said, kind of a new beginning, and a lot of people are feeling hopeful. And I think that's a very proper word. There's a lot of hope for future change, and I believe that creates a lot of enthusiasm and excitement in the Latino voter community.
I would throw this open to the panel, so feel free to chime in. So Romney and Obama have taken drastically different stances on immigration, and the question is, here you have Romney, who has established a platform of preventing immigrants from working, from immigrants self-deporting, in his own words, saying he wants to create an environment of self-deportation, and he's called the Arizona immigration law a model for the country. On the other hand, you have Obama in June announcing measures to stop deporting young immigrants who meet certain conditions and is in support of the DREAM Act. This indeed could be one of the issues where the difference between the candidates is most stark. And so, number one, we've seen this play out in the Latino community. Is this enough to motivate people to vote and to vote for the candidate that they feel is in line with their immigration policy?
First shot at that. I would even suggest that it's not just the Romney campaign, it's the entire rhetoric that often we hear from the Republican Party, and that really was really highlighted during the primaries, and the push from the Republican Party's conversations and the dialogue that they used very much alienates an entire demographic, a growing demographic and a young demographic. And as we work with Republican elected officials, they acknowledge that's a very difficult place for their party to be in right now. On the same token, the Obama administration also has a lot of work to do around taking courageous steps, and I also want to take a moment to just publicly acknowledge and applaud MSU, because the truth is there's not very many courageous leaders in our day and age, and I think that MSU is not just a model for this state, but for this entire country, and that's an important thing for us to acknowledge, because on both sides of the political spectrum right now, there's a lot of work to be done around issues that affect Latinos, and immigration is one of those. So my thoughts are that there has to be work to find public policy that advances this community, because quite frankly, the future of this country, and I'm not just saying this because I'm Latina and I work for a Latino organization. You can look at the data from the Census Bureau, and if you don't advance this community, this country is not going to move forward. So I think there are very stark differences, but both parties have a lot of work to do to address the issues. I just think that the Republican Party has a steeper hill to climb right now.
I'll jump in on that one as well. I think in terms of what we're seeing, in the context of the clear distinction, one of the best barometers of that is if you take a look at somebody who actually should be a valuable spokesperson for the Romney campaign, Governor Martinez from New Mexico, right, spoke at the Republican convention, was thought of as maybe a potential VP pick at one point. She publicly completely disagrees with self-deportation as a public policy issue and says that's just not, in the context of the U.S., a valuable policy. It's going to harm the population more so than anything. So I think if you have your own folks basically saying, wait a minute, that's not a good policy or a sound policy, I think that's a pretty good indicator of where our data is showing overwhelmingly. If you ask the question, which party do you think is best to tackle the issue of immigration policy, overwhelmingly Latino voters are saying the Democrats. Now, that doesn't get President Obama off the hook. I think when we talk about this enthusiasm, this persistent problem with Latino enthusiasm, what that's about is a perception among many Latino voters that, hey, we showed up in record numbers in 2008. We overwhelmingly supported President Obama largely because he promised comprehensive immigration reform during that campaign. So I think a lot of the frustration is, well, what happened? Well, why didn't we see that? And is it going to happen if you get a second term in office? So I think that's the backdrop, really what's driving the lack of enthusiasm among a lot of Latino voters. Specifically in the context of data on the DREAM Act, I think one of the things that's frustrating for a lot of us that stare at numbers all day long is that in the context of Latino voters, even Latino Republicans, an overwhelming majority of that population strongly supports the DREAM Act. And surprising to many, this is, you can check this out on Latino Decisions, our data, even a majority of white voters across the country support the DREAM Act. So I think it's frustrating for a lot of people to say, well, if the public supports this, why can't it get done? And I think that points back to the division in Congress and the lack of them to really pass anything. That also leads to the lack of enthusiasm.
Let me just jump in real quickly. I think one of the things that's important to recognize in this debate is that, or in this discussion, is that that's what politicians do is respond to voters. So it's very important that the Latino community, in order to have influence, actually gets out and votes. And I think there's a recognition, perhaps, of the cynicism in terms of the timing of the Obama DHS directive, but also equally a recognition that it's a function of political power at the voting booth. So, one of the things, because it's a unique distinction, and I sliced a little bit of this data here and there just to see what kind of underlying phenomena are going on. Among folks that cited immigration as the most important issue, 81% support Obama, and that's a fundamentally big distinction, larger, right, than the overall Obama-Romney split. 73% of those that's cited as the most important issue are very enthusiastic, and 62%, almost too close, 62% are more enthusiastic this election than in 2008, and those numbers are all higher than the overall average. So among the Latino community, those that are really focusing on immigration and seeing that distinction, and this is a pretty straightforward kind of cost-benefit model that political science has looked at for quite some time, that there is a policy distinction and an importance to going out to vote. And I think those things are actually starting to reverberate within the Latino community, or at least that's what this data suggests.
Dr. Preuhs, you bring up a very important point, and I want to stay on this just for a second. There was indeed a lot of skepticism with regard to when the decision came down in June to stop deportations and allow young undocumented students to study at the collegiate level. But you bring up a very important point as well in saying that, is that a bad thing, that the Latino community had the political power and the force and the voice and all the things, Sergio, that you were talking about, and the hunger strikes, et cetera, to force an administration to make those kinds of decisions? So skepticism perhaps, but a stronger political voice that maybe for the first time in a very long time was being heard at this scale. The question for me is whether that is going to translate to enthusiasm and whether the enthusiasm translates into voting. And so right now it seems like there's a challenge of getting out the vote in the Latino community if it is indeed predisposed to vote in certain directions. Please.
Oh, sorry. As far as enthusiasm goes, Together Colorado, we're working with about 40 different congregations and schools. We got about 50,000 families working with us, and we're going out. We're doing a lot of canvassing. We're doing a lot of phone banking. We're doing a lot of community outreach to people, so that not only can we give a bigger push, a bigger make our voice heard a bit more, but we're also letting people know about the important issues, the ones that are important to us as a community, because what we're looking for as an organization is we're trying to bring a greater justice and a greater feeling of fairness to our communities. People who have lived their entire lives in this country, who could be an exemplary person, someone who could be the meaning of an American, who's treated entirely different just because they were brought here at a very young age, or because they wanted to find a better opportunity for their families. And I guess what we're doing as an organization is we're trying to get people out there, and we're trying to tell people all of our stories. We're trying to get people pumped up for voting, for getting all these issues out and for them to understand what's really up at stake.
I'd like to and that as well, James, if I may. The work that Together Colorado is doing is really instrumental, and it's really part of a broader collaborative that's happening here in Colorado. A number of organizations, over 10 organizations, that work specifically with the Latino community year-round and in different issue areas, have partnered together to do a larger scale Get Out the Vote campaign that uses social media, mainstream media, knocking on doors, the canvassing that Sergio was talking about, knocking on doors, having conversations with people about these issues in the language that they feel comfortable with someone from their own community that might even be their neighbor, doing phone banks, all kinds of different activities to just, like I said earlier, drum that beat towards the election. That why is our vote important? It's critical, and it's critical because these issues are critical to our community, and it's critical that we turn out to vote so that we can win on these issues like the DREAM Act, like comprehensive immigration reform. For Mi Familia Vota, we've been partnering very, very closely with Together Colorado, with Claro, but also with Voto Latino, with National Council of La Raza, Colorado Progressive Coalition, a number of organizations here in Colorado to do just that. We're working in over 8 counties where we're knocking on doors, the most heavily populated Colorado counties, and then mail-in phone programs to another, I guess, I'm trying to think here, another 8 in total, or 7 in total, 14 counties that we're working in across the country, across the state, that are that encompass 89% of the Latino community here in Colorado. So we're really we're doing our best to mobilize the vote, the Latino vote, and stress that importance to the community of our political power. If we don't turn out this election, what does that mean for these issues that are so important to us? What is it? How else do we prove to the candidates that that our voice is strong and these are issues that are important to us? And if we don't get out to vote, we might not hear any more about comprehensive immigration reform. We might not get any closer to passing the DREAM Act. We might, get closer to losing some of these really critical health care benefits that we gain through the ACA, through the Affordable Care Act. So I can tell you that I think collaboratively we've registered over 45,000 Latino voters across the state of Colorado. Our efforts for the Get Out the Vote campaign will reach over 150,000 Latinos in the state, either through a direct knock on the door, phone bank, or a mail piece, or a combination of all three. So we are doing, I think, our piece as much as we can to turn out that vote.
And I know you probably want to move on to another question, but I just want to add very quickly. I think it's so important that what we take away from this deferred action decision is exactly that. It is cynicism, there is politics attached to it, and all the things that happen in this democracy. But quite frankly, the Latino community needs to sit down and say, we did that. We, as a community, the dreamers, the people that organized, made that happen. And so if this is the kind of policy we want to see as a community, we need to do it again and again and again. And that's the most important thing that we need. When we talk about voting, it's not just about that one day. It's about every day after that, talking to your elected officials and holding them accountable. Because, to James' point, we can't sort of be disappointed in the cynicism of the politics, or we can take ownership for our role in transforming these policy decisions.
And I know there are a couple of hands out here. We're going to open this up to questions, so get your questions ready. We're going to ask you to come up to the microphone in just a second. And before we do that, let me recognize Dr. Robert Hazan, who is chairing the Political Science Department here at MSU Denver. Thank you very much, Dr. Hazan, for being here. And do you have a comment or a question at this point? Please. Please.
My question is both data and non-data question. What is fascinating in the data is the consistency of Latina voters' support of President Obama, his administration, but also the Democratic Party's position, in particular on immigration. Now, my question is, and by the way, thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you all for participating. My question is to all of you, has the Obama administration, as perceived by Latino voters, really addressed the immigration issue in a flawless way? Naturally, my focus is on the data, and I don't have a clear idea of the numbers, but detentions and deportations in the last 4 years. Can you comment on that? In particular, how do Latina and Latino voters perceive that, and whether that has played a major factor in the way in which we see a variation in very enthusiastic or less enthusiastic categories? Thank you. And thank you again.
start, I mean, we do have data on that question. I mean, we've asked that question a few times. I think one thing that's important to get on record is the sophistication of the Latino voter is extremely high. So they're very conscious of the fact that, look, under President Obama, the deportation numbers are at all-time highs. They're very conscious of that dynamic, and they're holding the president accountable for that, which is why I think you see the enthusiasm numbers where they are. I think for the average Latino voter, though, you're stuck, between a rock and a hard place. Do you go with the known commodity, President Obama, who you have hope in, and our data still suggests that they have hope with him in the Democratic Party, or do you go with self-deportation? And I think that's really what bears out in the data, and that's obviously probably what folks are seeing on the ground. It's really a tough choice. They recognize the dynamics of what's going on in the context of the deportation numbers, as well as the fact that without comprehensive immigration reform, a lot of people don't realize the states are becoming much more active. There's been a record number of state immigration laws passed over the last couple of years where states usually don't get involved in that policy domain. So it's obvious we see Arizona, we see Alabama, but states across the country are moving in that direction. And I think Latino voters are extremely sophisticated in the same way that they were very conscious of the change in deportation policy more recently. They knew it was happening, and you saw the blips in terms of the overall numbers there. So I think you're exactly right on. That's what's driving the enthusiasm issue. But I think probably more so to do with what the Republican Party is doing related to immigration than rewarding President Obama for what he has done. I think that's really what the numbers bear out.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I think that the Latino community is not seeing this as black and white. This is not Obama administration failure. This is a failure of Congress, the Republicans in Congress that have blocked a lot of this public policy that would advance the community, but it's also a push toward the Obama administration to say you have to take a leadership position on this. And I think that plays out in the state as well. So on the asset bill, the frustration around if there's so much support around this policy issue from the general community, then why is it being blocked by one chamber and one political party? And it's much more complicated because then, of course, you want leadership to happen from the other side, and so it's a push and pull. But I don't think that I think that that's why the enthusiasm is still there, but not as high. There's a level of frustration, but people recognize it doesn't belong on the shoulders of one person.
To add to that, I mean, I think it's important also to realize that while immigration is one of the top issues, it's not the only issue. And I think, as Olivia has mentioned, and in terms of healthcare, in terms of education policy, in terms of economic policy, big questions like whether we should spend more or should reduce taxes, Latinos tend to align with the Democratic Party. So while we're talking about immigration as being, we should talk about immigration as being one component of this policy preference mix, and the alignment still, even when we remove immigration, tends towards the Democratic Party and the Obama administration. So that's going to help buoy support and maintain that level of support as well.
Just really quickly, I guess, kind of to mirror what we've all been saying, I guess, is in Spanish we have a saying. It says, "De Guatemala a Guatepeor." It's essentially choosing the lesser of two evils. I mean, with the Obama administration, we've seen that we have been pushing and we have been getting a response from him. And I mean, not just from him, but we're looking at it. We're looking at Romney now, and it's essentially cutting everything off. All of the things that we've worked for, and the Latino voters see this. There's a lot of time and effort being put into all of these issues, and the Romney administration just seeks to completely cut all of that off, to completely just take all of that work that we've put into this and throw it away. And I think that's really what's leading a lot of the enthusiasm towards the Obama re-election.
Dr. Hazan, I think it's an interesting question. Sergio. Olivia, I also thought that you made an excellent point in that, Dr. Preuss, you talked about immigration not being the only issue and education being very important, jobs in the economy. Olivia, you made the point that that immigration really can't be pulled apart from some of those other issues. That when you talk about education, you may indeed be responding about the asset there. You may indeed be responding about some of the other scholarships that are made available for higher education, some of those things. When you talk about jobs in the economy, it could be the same way with regard to providing jobs in the economy for every resident in the country, et cetera. So it's hard to pull apart each. Please ask your question of the individual panelists or the panel as a whole, and we'll do our best to answer those.
Hi, I'm Patty Kupfer. I work for America's Voice, and if anyone needs copies of the polling, we ran out. I'd be happy to get your email and send those to you afterwards. But my question is, it seems to me that since the Denver debate last week, the polls have tightened quite a bit, and I've heard about numbers in Colorado that show that perhaps Romney is even now ahead. If not, they're neck and neck. So I would propose that maybe the Latino vote in Colorado is all that much more important at this moment when where we have such a small margin. I'd be curious about your reactions to that, and also. For those of you doing the voter mobilization work, I know that we have seen in Colorado a lot of what we're seeing around the country in terms of voter ID laws, voter suppression, issues around access to the voting booth from a community that has, is traditionally disadvantaged in that way. So with this razor-thin margin in Colorado and such clear support for President Obama amongst Latino voters, how is that playing out, and what do you see as the potential impact there?
I think that absolutely with I think the last I saw yesterday was 47-47, Romney and Obama neck and neck, in a tie essentially here in Colorado. The Latino vote is even more critical. I absolutely believe that. No. I can tell you that when we briefed our canvassers yesterday, we went over the poll. Our canvassers go door to door, as I mentioned earlier. Right now we're working in Adams County. And we talked about it so that they fully understood their critical the critical role that they're playing in having conversations at the door with our Latino families in Adams County and explaining to them how critical their vote is. We're asking people to sign a commitment card that they are committing to voting, that they will be getting out to vote. We're getting the information about the vote by mail ballots that are going out next Monday on October 15th. The super critical 2 weeks of early vote that we were able to keep here in Colorado. We were able to defeat that state legislation earlier this year that sought to cut back on early voting times. Here in Colorado, we've been successful, thank God, in pushing back on any voter ID laws. We've seen them introduced for the last couple of legislative sessions here in the state legislature, and we have been successful again in defeating those. However, there is this aura of voter suppression happening in Colorado, mainly because of some of the work of our Secretary of State, Scott Gessler. As many of you know, he's been talking for the last couple of years of potential voter fraud, of potential non-citizens on the voter file, and that's just created this atmosphere of wait a second, am I really registered to vote? Am I eligible? It just causes some confusion in the community. I think for organizations like the three of ours and all of the other partners we're working with across the state, it's critical that we dispel some of that confusion and some of that myth of that. You are able to vote. You're a registered voter. these are the voting locations that, to make sure that they're as educated as possible to turn out the vote in order for us to go out and vote. I think that going back to some of the enthusiasm, I've actually seen the enthusiasm go up also because of Secretary of State Gessler and being in the media every week with some new story around supposed voter fraud that has still not been able to, he still has not been able to show any evidence of. That has really, I think, when anecdotally, I've had conversations with folks in the community, and they are always seeing that, this guy doesn't really want us to vote, and we can prove him wrong. We're going to turn out to vote, and we're going to turn out to vote in record numbers. But it's on us to educate the community about their rights as voters, and what IDs are permissible and are not permissible here in this state.
I'll take the voter suppression issue. I've been working on this for some time with my colleague Matt Barreto, also from Latino Decisions. We co-wrote the executive report in the Indiana Supreme Court case, the Pennsylvania case just recently, as well as Wisconsin. Luckily, in the context of Pennsylvania, our numbers, which overwhelmingly show that when you look at who does not have access to those required IDs, overwhelmingly it's Latino, foreign-born, older voters and low-income voters that don't have access to that ID. So luckily the data was overwhelming enough in the context of Pennsylvania to halt that law. So I think that's critical to understand the underlying demography of that issue, is that if you look at all those different communities, significantly older, lower income, Latino, foreign-born, African-American voters, those are all overwhelmingly Democratic voters. So it's no coincidence that you look at the states that are trying to push those laws, they're controlled by the Republican Party. So I think that's the underlying dynamic in terms of the question. In a tight state like Colorado, having that driver's license voter ID law will definitely be close enough to swing the election outcome. That's why there's so much energy invested in that particular law. In the context of the first question, will things tighten up? How does that play out, the importance of the Latino vote in Colorado? It's important to remind ourselves that Colorado only became a battleground state because of the demography changes in the last 10 years. And that was all a surge in the Latino electorate in the state of Colorado. So I think that speaks as much, if not anything, to the role that the Latino voter will play in this election, as well as elections for the next 20 or 30 years, particularly in this state.
Much for coming and putting this together. I have a question for Dr. Sanchez, but I wanted to just say I was really surprised with the strong support of Republicans in Rob's data, where 60% of the Republicans across in Colorado support asset. And I'm wondering that given this data, if in fact it would serve Romney well to support asset, and if in fact he does begin to support asset, what will that do to the enthusiasm for Latino and Latina voters in Colorado and throughout the United States? Because he has sort of changed his become more moderate in that, so I was wondering about that. So the enthusiasm, I think, is very important. I also wanted to ask Dr. Sanchez, Latino voters are not monolithic. And I think one of the things that we saw when you showed us the data for Florida is that if, in fact, Floridian Latinos are higher percentages Republican than they are in Colorado or in other states. Is that so? And I just saw President Obama's ad speaking in Spanish in Florida that played out in Florida yesterday. Do you think it's significant at all?
Speak to that. I mean, Florida is changing demographically significantly. A lot of folks don't realize in Florida, particularly Miami-Dade County, Cuban Americans are no longer the largest numeric population of Latinos there. So the demography is changing, and as a consequence, the partisanship allegiances of the population there are changing as well. So overall, I would say Florida is where you're most likely to find Latino Republicans. It's closer to a 50-50 split these days, but still much more so than Colorado, New Mexico, particularly Arizona and California. But what's important to note is, even among the Cuban American population in Florida, the notion of not being monolithic, generational status is critical there. If you look at younger Cuban Americans, folks that were not born in Cuba, don't really have any direct connection really to the Castro regime, those folks look like Latino voters in Colorado, New Mexico, and elsewhere. Agree strongly with the domestic policy agenda of the Democratic Party and vote democratically. So I think it's important, critically important, to look at the variation among the Latino population, among regions. And in terms of the language ads, I've actually been studying this. If you look at the TV ads that both Romney and Obama display in Florida, they might have the exact same script, but it looks significantly different than what they air here in Colorado, New Mexico, and elsewhere, just in terms of the actors that they hire. In Florida, they look Anglo, right? They look like Cuban Americans that look, for the most part, racially white. Same script, everything being the same. Out here, they look like me, right, the actors that they hire. So I think the candidates are conscious of that variation. They're finally catching up to those dynamics that you can't pitch one issue to all Latino voters nationally, and I think it's starting to show that trend nationally.
I want to ask a question about should Romney support asset? And I resoundingly say yes, all Republicans, and including the president, should support either bills like asset or the DREAM Act, because it's good public policy. The business community overwhelmingly supports this type of legislation. Educational institutions support this type of legislation. Community organizations that are working in these neighborhoods support this legislation. Schools, superintendents. It's very hard to find large institutional infrastructures that don't really support this type of legislation because it's good policy. The challenge for the Republican Party is that it's a politically divisive issue, and at the end of the day, I think that the Republican Party has to have a really, heart-to-heart with themselves and say, where do we see the future of this country? Because what they're caught between is hardline funders and extreme parts of their party that are hijacking the conversation and the policy. And again, I keep coming back to courageous leadership. That's what you need to find, and you need to find that in that party. Otherwise, they're never going to align with, again, a large demographic, not just Latinos, but communities across the state and across this country that say, look, we get it. We've got to fix this issue about immigration, and one of those is through comprehensive immigration reform and specifically through the DREAM Act. So I think that the Republican Party, when you talk to them individually, are pretty honest about that. They recognize that they've got a lot of division that they need to work through, and I would love to see that kind of leadership from our presidential candidates, because then I think that would really speak to the power of the Latino community across parties.
Let's go to another question.
Very insightful. I guess one question I have is that I want to pick up on your comment that imagine a Romney victory, and imagine that all these trend lines hold in terms of enthusiastic support and the margin of support. Can you give me a scenario where Romney is going to tackle comprehensive immigration reform?
I mean, I'll speak up. I mean, here you have a scenario where, if elected, the platform has been something that's not only oppositional to the direction that a lot of Latino leaders in the community has led, but it's reprehensible. It's actually something beyond undesirable. And if put in office that way, where's the incentive for Romney to lead any charge towards an immigration reform that would be satisfactory with the Latino community? I mean, I fail to see the incentive. I don't know if other panelists might see something differently, but under these conditions, if elected, there's really no incentive to go after comprehensive immigration reform.
I mean, I think it's important also to recognize that the Republican Party these days is really 2 or 3 Republican parties. And so there is a strong segment of the Republican base that would advocate for comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, folks don't remember former President Bush. That was his #1 domestic policy issue. Would have happened if it wasn't for 9/11. So there are semblances of the Republican Party who very much would like to see that happen. Largely the economic business community within the Republican Party recognizes the economic value of that. But you've had the Tea Party segment of that party really, push that issue so far to the right that I agree there's probably not a politically feasible way for Romney to do that if he were elected, but that doesn't mean that all Republicans think monolithically on that issue. I think that's important to remind ourselves about.
One last point there is that you're going to have to look 4 years out, right? So Romney gets elected, what do the demographic changes look like in 4 years? You may have pulled this one off, right, without the battleground state support of Latinos. You're certainly solidifying that Democratic support among the community after this election. But you're probably going to need to change in order to continue to win national elections. And so, that electoral incentive might be there as you're thinking about the dynamic of this changing demographic. And we don't know exactly where that's going or how big, but that's one consideration.
That's a great point. All right, let's take one final question, please.
First of all, I want to mention, despite what some on the panel might think, the Republican Party is not a racist, bigoted party. I'm actually kind of upset that there's not a conservative Republican Latino on the panel. But my second question is, we see the Catholic Church is an enemy of the Obama administration. Many conservatives, or many Latinos are conservative. Are Latinos and African Americans being brainwashed by the Democratic Party to believe that the Republican Party is racist and doesn't like them, and that's why we see these numbers, when in fact the numbers should be the other way? Because really, if you look at unemployment rates, if you look at conservative social issues, these numbers should be completely opposite.
Yeah. Well, let me start. First of all, Republican Hispanics were invited and did never return. So we apologize for not having a more diverse, but certainly the effort was there. In terms of the question of how broad Latino support is, when it comes down to it, and these recent polls are interesting. One is that in terms of social policy preferences, there's not nearly the diversion that we might think. A majority of Latinos support civil unions, for instance. Even among, in this data set that I was playing with just actually last night, because I was curious, even among those that supported abortion, gay marriage, and family values, the split was still about 50-50 in terms of Obama, so it wasn't overwhelmingly Republican. And this is, I think, is a key point, is that only 1% of this sample cited those issues as important, right? So these aren't big issues to the Latino community. Now, having said that, right, I think we also recognize that relative to other policy preferences, I guess it would be the same thing, since overwhelming a majority of Anglos support the Republican Party in this state, that Anglos are being brainwashed. I'm not so sure. My sense is, from an individualistic perspective, that everyone has preferences and they pretty much follow those, that folks aren't being duped too much. But at the same time, right, we need to consider this, and one of, I think, the bigger question down the line is, okay, I mean, what would the Republican Party need to do, right, in order to gain Latino support? One might be immigration policy. Would there be a slightly different, in terms of the data here, a majority of Latinos prefer more spending as opposed to less taxes, so a pretty typical Democratic component. What exactly is that strategy that can draw Latinos back into the Republican Party? And I don't even know in Colorado if we can say back, right? It's been a long history of Latino support for Democrats in Colorado. So I don't know, maybe that's a broader question. If it's not just immigration, what else can the Republican Party do, or have they lost the Latino vote?
Any final comments from panelists?
I'll touch on the direct question about, what's often said is, I've heard Republican candidates say this for decades, Latinos are really Republican, they just don't know it yet. And I think that's within the context of your question, the social issues. So one thing we've asked directly on national polls a couple of times, straightforwardly, when it comes to politics and how you decide your vote, is politics defined to you on moral issues such as abortion and gay marriage, same-sex marriage, or is it about the economy? And 80% of Latino voters nationwide, including Latino Republicans, say it's about the economy, not so much those policy issues that worked very well for former President Bush. That strategy worked in that era, not so much now. The difficulty with Romney's message of the higher unemployment rates among Latinos, which have hovered around 12% nationally, much higher than the national average. So you're very right that the economic collapse has hurt Latinos probably more so than any other demographic group in the country. But when you ask Latino voters directly, who do you blame for the economic collapse? The overwhelming majority of Latino voters say either Republicans in Congress now or former President Bush, not so much President Obama. So I think that's the difficulty of that message resonating well with the average Latino voter, who just doesn't see the economic collapse that has hurt them disproportionately being on the hands of the president.
Of course not. Because they're told it's not.
Can I add something to that? I mean, I think it's misleading to suggest that their pay has gone down. The
Moderator's prerogative here and tie us up. We're a couple minutes over our time. I want to thank all the panelists for being on the panel. Indeed, immigration is one of the issues where the differences between the two candidates and the platforms is the most stark. The question is, how does this play in the Latino community, and will this drive Latinos to vote in November 2012? Let's thank our panelists, and especially Dr. Preuhs for bringing us together.
Thank you. Thank you once again all for coming. It's been a wonderful pleasure and an honor for MSU Denver to have all of you here, give us our comments. And again, if anybody has any questions, I'm here around for a little bit. I'd be happy to chat with you. We're in class. Have a good afternoon, folks. Thank you all for coming.